Cast your mind back, if you would, to a 2 week or so period in February of this year. I know it's a stretch. I know this seems like the distant past. But if you can, try to remind yourself what the media climate was like in February of this year, just a little over a month ago. There was a narrative that had proliferated, which held that there was such a surge of anti Semitic sentiment in the United States, seemingly at the behest of Trump and his most exercised supporters, that truly Jews ought to be fearful for their own safety and for the safety of their children. Now, what was the linchpin of this narrative? What was the central impetus for why it had become so dominant? That was the spate of bomb threats, which have been called to various Jewish cultural institutions across the country over a span of a couple weeks. And they seem to really pick up dramatically in early to mid February. Now, of course, bomb threats are bad. I don't think anybody of sound mind really disputes that. And you can certainly sympathize with parents who have their young children at, say, a daycare center that has to be evacuated on account of a bomb threat being called in. So nobody has ever denied, and I've certainly never denied, that people who perpetrate bomb threats, meaning they cause disruption in the lives of perfectly innocent people, they should be apprehended and punished so as to prevent further bomb threats. But that wasn't really the narrative that was occasioned by that spate of threats. The narrative that was occasioned was that there is this surge or this societal upswing in anti-Semitic fervor, and that surge could be traced to a wider political narrative. That being that Trump and his band of advisors and supporters had knowingly or unknowingly, a lot of people asserted that it was knowing or willful or explicit. But in some sense, the accusation was that Trump had abetted or enabled this purported rise in anti-Semitism. Now, if that were true, that would definitely be troubling. Anti-Semitism is undoubtedly one of the great scourges of history. It is contemptible. The idea that Jews have any kind of intrinsic qualities that make them inherently sinister or devious, etc., that's an odious viewpoint, and it should be condemned where it surfaces. So my idea and the idea of people who were maybe a little leery of this narrative in February, we never mounted any kind of defense of anti-Semitism. Of course, no. Anti-Semitism is terrible. And to the extent that it's been stamped out, that should be celebrated. And if it does ever surface, happy to condemn it. But what happened in February was that there was this mindless wave of hysteria that was stoked from the most mainstream establishment quarters. And the narrative held that this swing in anti-Semitic sentiment was obviously a result of Nazis gaining power. There were some people, yes, who espoused that view. There were others who said that anti-Semitism was now such a profound threat that Jews should actually take tangible actions in their lives to avoid perhaps becoming victims of some systematic extirpation campaign. I mean, that's how extreme the rhetoric got. And remember, the linchpin of this fervor was the spate of anti-Semitic phone calls and bomb threats that were sent into Jewish institutions. So I can recall my reaction being, now, wait just a moment. Shouldn't we at the very least have some basic identifying information as to the nature and motivations of the perpetrator or perpetrators of these bomb threats before we go and make grand extrapolations as to what the political meaning is? Because initially, we had no information at all about who had done these threats. Was it an American even? Was it a non-American? Was it a rabid Trump supporter? Was it an extremist Muslim? Was it some troll? We had no idea. But that did not stop people of great influence and prestige in the media from just rattling off the most hyperbolic interpretation of this series of events, claiming that Nazis were on the march, anti-Semites on the rise, and that Trump bore responsibility for this directly. So eventually, the narrative became so salient that Trump did, in fact, address it head-on in the lead of his address to a joint session of Congress on February 28th. So that means the narrative was powerful. I mean, it percolated all the way up to the President of the United States, who was at a certain point compelled to address it. It turns out that the narrative was based on, if not a fraud, a utter misrepresentation of the actual facts. So, as some of you may not be aware by now, the person identified as being responsible for over 100 of these bomb threat phone calls was an Israeli American residing in Israel. A 19-year-old whose representatives now claim that he had some kind of neurological condition that impaired his judgment and contributed to him calling in these threats. So that negates the narrative for the simple reason that the perpetrator apparently was not even located in the United States. So he couldn't represent, or he couldn't be reflective of a surge in anti-Semitic sentiment for that very basic, almost banal reason. And then, of course, that he's a Jew is also a complicating factor. Now, that's not to say that a Jew can't theoretically espouse anti-Semitic views. There's definitely a history of that. But at the very least, it kind of made the easy narrative that had been constructed a little questionable. Now, I ask you to just ponder this hypothetical. So the perpetrator of the bomb threats turns out to be, a 28-year-old white guy, an avowed Trump supporter, in his basement somewhere in Arkansas. Maybe he had been egged on by his fellow anti-Semitic Trump-supporting colleagues, and he carried out these threats for the purpose of, to his mind, helping to facilitate Trump's agenda. He did it for a pro-Trump reason. Now, do you think that guy's photo would have been plastered on the news and on Twitter and all over the place for, a week? Do you think that that guy's life history would be parsed and he would be, really roundly and rightly condemned for his actions? Would there be a media uproar if the perpetrator was found to be that guy? I think probably. And yet, the reaction to the arrest of this Israeli-American teenager in the bomb threat case was received with a bizarrely muted reaction. Very little, at least relatively speaking, was made of this arrest compared to the totally dominant furor around the bomb threats in February. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, for one thing, I wrote a full Medium post about it, which I am, in a sense, promoting here and will be linked to in the description box. But the ultimate effect of these narratives that the media and people who are kind of tangential to the media but influential, the effect of them stoking these narratives that prove to be bogus have the effect of discrediting the media. And what does that do? That strengthens Trump's hand. Because Trump, when he was initially kind of hectored into addressing this at a press conference, he said something a little dismissive, and he kind of skirted around the issue and rejected the premise of the question and said, I don't need to talk about this anti-Semitism stuff. I'm just paraphrasing there. But that created a big reaction because people were wondering, why won't Trump condemn this? Well, it turns out that maybe some skepticism as to the veracity of that narrative which had been fomented was warranted. So when a narrative that had been fomented dissolves or falls apart upon examination, the people who push that narrative end up looking hysterical and idiotic. And Trump comes away as looking vindicated. So if you want to strengthen Trump's hand and you want to give credence to his anti-media diatribes, the best thing you could do is to thoughtlessly stoke these repeated frenzies and manias, which, upon minimal inspection and with a little bit of rationality, tend to fall apart. That's the best thing you can do. Keep doing that, because that will really give Trump traction in his media critique. And, the people who were responsible for furthering this alarmist narrative in February, so not that long ago, a little over a month ago, approximately, none of these people faced any kind of reputational sanction, of course. None of them faced any kind of social or professional sanction. They just keep on with what they've had been doing, and nothing changes. So, unfortunately, there is very little reason to believe that any of this, which should be an embarrassment, is going to result in the media adjusting how it processes these alleged frenzies or crazes. It'll probably be more or less the same going forward, and Trump's hand will be strengthened. So my advice is, don't strengthen Trump's hand. Try to exercise some caution and circumspection and rationality, and then you'll be able to counter Trump's worst instincts, because Lord knows there's plenty about Trump that is worth criticizing and that needs to be countered. So that is my little spiel for the night. I lay out all the citations and expound on these points a little more comprehensively in the Medium post, which came out today, and I will link to in the description box. So read that, let me know what you think, and be well.